I would have liked to make this video outside, but as you can see, here in Quebec on April 2nd, 2023, the insect and the flowers are not here yet. So let's get inside. Pour ceux qui ne parlent pas anglais, vous pouvez visionner cette vidéo en français en cliquant dans le coin droit en haut. Moving away to get closer. It sounds funny, but this is how the laws of optics are made. As I explained in my video, the tracing of light rays in macrophotography, when a subject is getting closer to the lens, its image at the back is moving away. Let's take this lens. When it is set at infinity focus, the lens has a certain length. If I turn the focusing ring to its minimum focus, then I realize that the lens has elongated and it has moved forward 18.5 millimeter. Or, in other words, the lens has been moving away from the sensor 18.5 millimeter to reach the minimum focus. This basic principle of focusing a lens from infinity to minimum focus by moving the lens away from the sensor apply to most of the lenses on the market. For example, on a wide angle, a 28 millimeter lens, the travel distance is about 4.3 millimeter. For a 50 millimeter lens, 1.4, the travel is about 7.7 millimeter. For a 135 millimeter lens, the one that we just checked, the travel is about 18.5 millimeter from infinity to minimum focus. And for the 55 macro lens from Nikon, an old lens, this lens has a special helicoid ring, and the travel for this lens is 27.5 millimeter. So you can reach at the minimum focus half-size magnification with that lens. On the other hand, there is some lenses like this 105 micro Nikkor that do not extend when you turn the focusing ring from infinity to minimum focus and from minimum focus back to infinity. It always stays the same length. These lenses use a different focusing principle that is called internal focusing. In internal focusing, instead of having all the elements moving forward or away from the sensor, the front lens doesn't move and the other lenses inside are changing position relative to each other with different displacement. In internal focusing, it's not the space between the sensor and the lens that change, but it's the focal length of the lens that decrease. The closer you get to the subject, the smaller is the focal length. Example, at infinity, we have a focal length of 105 millimeter, while at 1:1 ratio, 1:1 life-size magnification, the focal length changed to be about 80 millimeter. I'm not quite sure about the exact value. Before going any further, let me remind you the equation of the magnification M. M equal the supplementary extension divided by the lens focal length. From this equation we can deduce two important facts. The first one is, if you increase the supplementary extension, then the magnification will increase. The second fact is, if you decrease the focal length of the lens, the magnification will also increase. So that means to get high magnification, you need a lot of supplementary extension and a short focal length. Let's take an example. If I want to take a picture of a subject and I want it to be life-size or 1x magnification on the sensor, with all the previous lenses I mentioned earlier, I will need a different extension. For example, with the 28mm lens, to get 1:1, I will need 28mm of supplementary extension. For the 50mm lens, I will need 50mm of supplementary extension. For the 55 macro lens, I will need 55mm of extension. And for the 135mm lens I showed you earlier, I will need 135mm of extension to get 1:1 or life-size magnification. Of course, if you look at the equation and these different values, it seems to be advantageous to use a wide-angle lens or a short focal length because you need less extension. On the other hand, when you work with a wide-angle or a short focal length, the subject has to be very close to the lens to be in focus. Otherwise, with the longer lens, like the 135, you will have a longer distance in front of the lens, which is better if you want to take picture of insects, for example, or if you have the sun in your back and you don't want to cast a shadow on your subject. The longer the focal length, the more room you will have between the lens and the subject. So getting the right combination of extension tube and lenses is a compromise between having enough extension and having a short focal length or a longer focal length. When you do macro photography with extension tube or with macro bellows, the image projected on the sensor is enlarged, and at the same time it's also reduced in light luminosity. The light loss that you get when you do macro photography can be calculated, but here I won't give you any equation or formula to calculate that simply because the light meter inside of the modern camera can calculate the light loss easily and compensate for that light loss. It will either increase the exposure time or increase the ISO value. This way, the camera compensates automatically for the light loss and give you the right exposure no matter how long extension tube you put on the lens and the camera. In close-up photography and macro photography, the depth of field is very, very shallow. So when you want to focus on a subject with a shallow depth of field, you can try to do it by turning the focusing ring until you get the sharp image, but it is not the best way, because when you turn the focusing ring, you are doing two things at the same time. You are adjusting the distance from the subject to the lens, but you are also modifying the distance between the sensor and the lens, and that change of distance in the back also changed the magnification. So when you try to focus using the focusing ring, at the same time you try to make the subject sharp, you are also changing the magnification, so you may not get the right enlargement as you want. So the best way when you do focusing with macro equipment is, instead of twisting the focusing ring, you adjust the focusing ring to the magnification you want, either by setting it on the lens or by using extension tube on the lens. And once you get the right combination for the magnification you want, now you don't touch the focusing ring anymore. You just put the lens, the camera on the manual mode for focusing, and looking in the finder, you just move forward and backward until the subject gets sharp. When it is sharp, then you have the magnification you choose, and you have a sharp subject. Of course, with the shallow depth of field, trying to maintain that exact, precise distance is not easy. If you can afford to work with a tripod, then I would recommend you to use a focusing rail like this one or some like this one. And with those focusing rail, you can adjust precisely the distance between the subject and your lens. Okay, now let's talk about the equipment. We will start with the extension tube. The least expensive tube you can find in the market is made of screwing type extension tube. So you can screw these tube together. This one is quite big because this is a one that I made myself. Normally these tube you will find them in thickness comparable to the regular extension tube, not so big. So these cheap or these non-expensive extension tube are made of screw-in type tube that you can screw to an adapter, a male bayonet that you can fit your camera, and a female bayonet to which you can fit your lens. Then you can attach the lens to the tube and you can attach the assembly to your camera. So this kind of attachment, normally it's a lot smaller than what you see here. This kind of attachment has no communication with the camera. It's only a spacer that you put between the lens and the camera. Okay, like I just said, the least expensive extension tube you can buy doesn't have any communication with the camera, but you can find also some extension tube that can communicate somehow with the camera. In this case, these tubes are made with a male bayonet at the back and a female bayonet at the front, and there is inside of that tube some kind of a lever that will transmit the command to the diaphragm so it closes down when you take a picture. So with these, you mount them directly in the camera. You can stack them if you want. And when you got the extension you need, you finally mount the lens to this assembly. The advantage of this system is that you can view the subject with the diaphragm wide open, and when you click to take the picture, the diaphragm will close at the chosen aperture. This way you have a nice bright view in the viewfinder, and when you take the picture, your lens is going to close down at the desired aperture. Now let's see the third type of extension tube you can find in the market. It's probably the one that you should buy because it's the most, let's say, the most advanced. Because today modern camera doesn't have mechanical diaphragm like we had before. So because they don't have this mechanical diaphragm anymore, to close down and open the diaphragm in your lens, you will need some electrical contact to connect it to the camera. And when you choose the aperture from your camera body, when you take the picture, the diaphragm is going to close down at the aperture you have chosen. So to use modern camera lens and modern camera, you will need some extension tube that have exactly the same electrical contact that you have on your camera and your lens. So these ones are not made by the camera manufacturer, they are made by an independent manufacturer. This brand is the Kenko, and they fit to the Nikon, as you can also find the one that will fit Canon, Minolta or Sony. So with these, it's exactly like before. You just assemble the tube to your camera. You can put more if you want to, and then you can attach the lens to the camera. With this tube, since you don't have an aperture ring on the lens, you will have to set the aperture from your camera, and when you will take the picture, the aperture will close down at the desired aperture. It also communicates for the autofocus if you want, but as I said before, in macro photography the depth of field is so thin that trying to use the autofocus in close-up photography or macro photography is very difficult. It's better to unlock the autofocus on your camera, put it on manual, and then when you take the picture you just look at the subject and you move back and forth until the subject is in sharp focus. One thing I'd like to mention about the extension tubes is about their thickness. If I take the Nikon collection of extension tube here, the thinnest one has a thickness of 8 mm. The next one is 14 mm, and the last one is 27 mm. If I use the 8 mm with a 28 mm lens, which has only 4.3 mm travel, then I'm going to create some hole in the magnification chart, as you can see in the corner. Because from infinity to minimum focus I can have magnification from 0 to 4.3. Then if I bring back to infinity and I put the 8 mm tube behind it, there is going to create a hole between 4.3 and 8 mm in the chart, which means I cannot get that magnification. You can either go smaller or bigger if you don't have any choice, or what you can do instead is make sure that you use a lens that has a travel long enough to cover these lens. Here my 50 mm lens has a travel of 7.7, which is almost 8. With this lens I get almost a complete range of magnification available, from the smallest magnification to the biggest magnification. So the hole I will have with this lens are less important than with the other lens. And of course, if you go with a lens like the 135, which has 18.5 mm travel, which is quite big compared to 8 mm, or even better, if I use the 55 macro lens that has 27 mm travel, this lens is going to fit any of those extension ring here or any combination, and will always have will always cover all the range of magnification available, as you can see on the chart. Okay, now let's talk about the benefit and the disadvantage, the inconvenience of extension tube. The first benefit is they are compact. They are also lightweight, so carrying them is not much, and they are very easy to install on your camera, like you saw it before. You just detach the lens, attach the extension tube like you would attach a lens, and when in position, then you just reattach a lens in the extension tube. So they are easy to install and remove from the camera. And another advantage is they do not reduce the quality of your lens, because the extension tube are empty tube with no lens inside. When you take macro picture with your lens, you get the original quality of your lens with no degradation. The inconvenience or the disadvantage of the extension tube are, the first one is the loss of luminosity. As we saw before, the more you move away the lens from the sensor, the more the image is enlarged on that sensor, and when the image is enlarged, its luminosity is reduced. Okay, so the more extension tube you will have, the more light loss you will have. So that's one of the inconvenience of the tube compared to the close-up lens. Like close-up lens do not affect that much the exposure. Another inconvenience of the extension tube is like we saw, to attach the extension tube you have to remove the lens from the camera, attach the tube, put the lens back, and when you want to remove it, detach the lens, detach the tube, put the lens back. All these manipulation that you do expose the sensor to possible dust that there is in the air. And of course, maybe inside it's quite safe because there is not much dust inside of a house, but when you work outside, and if there is a small breeze or small wind, possible dust may enter into the camera body and will eventually get onto your sensor. And once it's onto the sensor, you get a dust mark on your picture. So that's one of the inconvenience of the tube. You have to remove it and put it back, exposing the camera sensor. And finally, depending on the choice of ring you have and the choice of lens you have, you may encounter some hole into the magnification chart that I saw you just before. These holes, of course, can be corrected by replacing the lens if you have the possibility. Then with another lens you may fill up the gap. But if you don't, you may have some magnification unavailable. The macro bellow. What is a macro bellow? The macro bellow is a spacer, like the extension tube is a spacer. The bellow is a spacer with an adjustable length as you may need. Between the back and the front of the bellow, there is an accordion type bellow that can be adjusted to the desired length and then to the desired magnification. Two rails on the bellow. The top rail is used to adjust the length of the bellow, consequently the magnification that you need. And the bottom rail is used to focus the bellow. So when you move it, the bellow can go toward the subject or away from the subject. It's very easy to use. It's like the extension tube. All you have to do is to attach the camera at the back of the bellow, and then you attach the lens at the front of the bellow. And this is ready to use. Because of the extension of the bellow, and because there is no mechanical or electrical connection between the front and the back of the bellow, some bellows are equipped with some special function, like this Olympus bellow, and the same for the new Nikon PB6 bellow. There is a mechanism in the front base which can open and close the diaphragm. The advantage of such a mechanism is that you can do the focus, the lens wide open, and when you want to take the picture, you can just close down the aperture by moving a lever on the front plate of the bellow. Of course, to simplify this function, Olympus and the Nikons and other company have created the mechanism that open and close the diaphragm can be connected to a double cable release. The double cable release has this function. When you first press the shutter halfway, the first cable release close down the diaphragm. And when you press down the rest of the movement, the second cable release the camera shutter. So it's a continuous movement. Close down the diaphragm, take the picture. So it's very quick and easy to use, and you have the advantage of working wide open to make your focus. And when it's time to take the picture, the mechanism close the diaphragm to the wanted aperture, so you get the right depth of field. So easy to use. You just connect it to the base. Same thing with the new PV6 Nikon, and you connect the other end into your camera shutter. Of course, this old Nikon bellow doesn't have this mechanism, but Nikon have made for this bellow a ring called BR4. The BR4 ring can be inserted between the lens and the bellow. So you attach the ring to the bellow at the front, and then you can attach the lens to the ring. This way you have a connection to your lens, and as in the other bellow, you can first close down the diaphragm, then release the shutter. Bellows can be used with regular lens to get high magnification, or with a specialized lens like this one to get high magnification. To get magnification, when you put a lens on the bellow, normal lenses are normally designed to get a short distance at the back and a long distance at the front. But when you work with a bellow, often the long distance is at the back and the short distance is at the front. So for this reason, bellows are designed to be able to invert the lens. Like this Olympus bellow or the Nikon PV6, you can detach the bellow from the front plate. Then you can remove the lens, front plate, from the bellow, return it, reattach the front plate to the bellow, and then reattach the bellow to the lens. Now the lens is inverted. So the back of the lens is made for a short distance, which is normal here, and the front of the lens is on the long distance at the back. So doing this, we are optimizing the optical quality for the macro photography. Some bellow, like the old one here, doesn't have this capability of returning the lens plate. So what Nikon did for that, they just made a reverse adapter. So what you do, you just take the lens, screw it in the filter thread at the front of the lens, and once it is there, you just attach the lens reversed in front of the bellow. So now the lens is reversed and the optimal optical design is respected, showing a short distance on the back of the lens with a long distance at the front of the lens. It is not common, and this is rarely used in macro photography, but some bellows are designed to do the same movement that view camera do when the professional photographer takes picture. You have probably seen those photographer with those large camera and with a cloth over their head. They were adjusting the lens, and sometimes they were tilting the lens left and right to twist the lens at the front, and sometimes they also shift it right and left to move the lens off axis at the front. Some rarely, but some picture can be taken with that functionality. And some bellow like this, the Nikon bellow, has this capability. If you unlock the mechanism, you will see that I can tilt or twist the lens. And same thing, if I want, I can shift the lens right and left. I can shift and tilt, or I can go the other way, shift and tilt. To be honest, this is rarely used today. There is other way to increase depth of field that I will eventually talk to you. We call that focus stacking. This function was there to help to optimize depth of field in some specific type of photography. Years ago, I bought this Nikon bellow. I think it's in the 1970s because of its quality and its construction. And later, maybe around the 80s or the 90s, I can't remember exactly, I discovered those Olympus lenses that are specially designed for macro bellow works. So they are not designed to be used on the camera directly. They are made to be used on a bellow, and of course they are optimized to give us good quality at high magnification. So I wanted to get those lenses, but to keep them as automated as possible, I needed to buy the bellow that goes with them, the Olympus bellows. With these lenses, I can work with the automatic aperture like I showed you just before, and I wanted to keep that function, so I had to buy the bellow. But the Olympus bellow doesn't fit my Nikon. So to do that, what I did is I just made an adapter. I just made an adapter. It's a two-piece adapter. I bought a male bayonet T adapter for Nikon, and I bought a female bayonet adapter for Olympus. Both adapters can be screwed together to fit, and this way I have one side that fit to Nikon and one side that fit to Olympus. So you can find some of those adapters already made available, so you can buy them already made. You may not have to make it yourself, or it's quite easy to make it yourself if you want to. So now with that adapter, I can take a Nikon body, attach it to the Olympus bellow. Let me balance it. Attach it to the Olympus bellow, and now I can use those specialized lenses and bellow on my Nikon equipment. What are the advantage and the inconvenience of the macro bellow? The first advantage that I will have for the macro bellow is that between 40 millimeter and 200 millimeter, we have a continuous extension. So there is no gap, there is no room to have where you don't have magnification possible, like we saw before. With the accordion type, you can vary the length as you want. Another advantage is that the extension is quite long on the bellow compared to an extension tube. As you can see, it's a lot longer, and of course you can get a lot more magnification than you can get with the extension tube. Finally, we just saw it before, it is possible to mix equipment. I mean by that, I showed you that I can use my Nikon camera on the Olympus bellow and the Olympus lens, and this is quite easy with the right adapter. So that's a big advantage. You can use what you want, the equipment you want, on whatever camera you have. What are the disadvantage or the inconvenience? First, as you can see, it is quite heavy and bulky to manipulate. So this is hard to carry in your camera bag compared to extension tubes that are quite small and easy to carry. Of course, if you cannot handle that whole assembly in your hand, it requires a tripod. So people who don't like to work with tripods, it's not the right tool for you. The accordion type bellow that is here could be very fragile. You have to be careful if you don't want to puncture the bellow, because if you puncture the bellow or if you break it, there will be a light leak inside, and if there is a light leak, it's going to affect your pictures. Of course, like the extension tube, when you attach the camera or when you attach the lens, there is a possibility of dust getting inside of the system, and then if it gets inside of the camera, it can get onto your sensor, which will appear on your pictures. And also the fact that since this is an accordion type of bellow, when I'm closing it down, I'm pumping air out of it, and when I'm opening the bellow, I'm pumping air into the bellow. So that movement of air can also carry dust inside of the system. So that's one of the inconvenience of this of the bellow compared to those. So you have to be careful with dust and make sure that you keep your equipment clean and dust free as much as possible. Okay, what type of picture can you do with extension tube or macro bellows? Let's take a look at some example before I do my conclusion. In conclusion, with extension tubes and macro bellows, you can obtain very high magnification with no loss of quality from the original lens. Often they are less expensive than dedicated macro lens. You can use lens from the same brand or a different manufacturer if you want, and that can be either wide angle or telephoto lenses. You can even use enlarger lens if you want, and enlarger lenses are often considered as excellent macro lens. If you enjoyed this video, please click the like button under this video. At the same time, if you are not already subscribed to my channel, please click the button subscribe. If you have any friend who enjoy photography and macro photography, let them know about my channel. The larger will be my audience, the more motivated I will be to create more video like this one. To all of you that saw my video, thank you. And until next video, enjoy photography.